June 4, 1943. Mexia, Texas. 150 battle-hardened Germans, veterans of Rommel's Afrika Korps, stepped off the train expecting punishment. Instead, they saw electric light. Every farmhouse, every street corner, every shop window blazed with steady brilliance. It was 10:30 at night, yet the Texas plains shimmered like midday. For men who had marched through the blacked-out cities of Europe, this sight was impossible. Germany had lived in darkness since 1940. Entire towns vanished under blackout curtains. Rural electrification had touched barely 20% of German farms. But here, in the so-called decadent America, electricity flowed like water. "The Americans must be lying," wrote Unteroffizier Werner Burkhardt in his hidden diary. "No nation can have such abundance while fighting a war on two fronts." They had arrived not in cattle cars, but in Pullman coaches, cushioned seats, dining cars with white tablecloths, even sleeping berths. One guard apologized that the air conditioning was broken. Air conditioning. The word itself felt absurd. On the platform, the townspeople gathered quietly. No taunts, no hatred, just curiosity. A little girl passed a flower to an American sergeant and pointed shyly at the captured soldiers. The veterans stood rigid, unsure whether to feel humiliated or confused. These were not the barbarians they had imagined. Behind the station, oil derricks turned slowly under floodlights. Somewhere in the distance, unseen engines hummed, a mechanical pulse that seemed to run through the ground itself. America was alive. Vast, illuminated, tireless. That night in Mexia marked the beginning of what historians would later call the American Revelation. It began not with speeches, but with sensory assault, light, sound, comfort, and abundance that no German propaganda could explain away. In the coming months, those same men would see radar antennas mounted on cargo ships, eat meat twice a day aboard Liberty transports, and ride trains more luxurious than any in the Reich. Yet it all began here, with light where there should have been darkness. "We had been told they were collapsing," Burkhardt wrote weeks later. "Instead, we saw a civilization running at full power, in the middle of war." That realization would spread like a silent infection through every POW camp in America, dismantling the idea of Nazi superiority one observation at a time. The guns had fallen silent for these men, but the real defeat was only beginning. May 1943, Oran, Algeria. The Desert War was over. What had begun as the proud campaign of the Afrika Korps ended beneath American floodlights and clipboards. On May 13th, General von Arnim, Rommel's replacement, surrendered over 250,000 Axis soldiers in Tunisia. For weeks, the captured units were funneled into holding camps near Oran. Tents, barbed wire, and neat rows of signs in German, French, and English. But it wasn't the captivity that stunned them. It was the efficiency. Feldwebel Hans Meurer of the 21st Panzer Division described it best in a letter written months later. "They processed thousands of us as if they had rehearsed it for years. Photographs, medical checks, identification cards. They explained our Geneva rights in perfect German. It was terrifying. Not their weapons, but their organization." The U.S. Army had built an administrative machine so vast that even in war it ran like a peacetime factory. Every prisoner was catalogued, tagged, inoculated, and fed. Every form was printed in triplicate. Within 48 hours, over 30,000 men were registered and awaiting transport. And then came the second shock: the food. While they waited for ships, the Americans fed them like allies instead of enemies. White bread, real coffee, meat twice a day. For soldiers who had lived on tinned rations and sawdust bread since El Alamein, it felt like a hallucination. "We thought it was a trick," wrote Meurer. "Propaganda to weaken us. Then we saw the guards eating the same food. That was their standard ration. Those guards, often barely older than the prisoners, spoke casually about ship schedules and cargo deliveries that dwarfed German capacity. They mentioned that the SS Robert E. Peary, a Liberty ship, had been built in 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes. The prisoners laughed at first. It sounded like a fairy tale. 4 days to build a ship? Impossible. But 2 weeks later, they boarded one. The Peary and her sister ships became floating classrooms in American power. Each vessel had radar turning above the bridge, refrigeration systems in the galley, and hot showers for the crew. For men who had fought in desert heat with 1 canteen of water per day, it was like traveling inside a myth. Feldwebel Kurt Zimmermann of the 90th Light Division noted something haunting in his letters home. They throw away food, whole loaves of bread, half-eaten steaks, not in cruelty but carelessness, as if supply were infinite. To a generation raised on ration cards and discipline, waste was sin. But to the Americans, it was simply logistics, the side effect of limitless production. As the convoy set out for the Atlantic, the Germans stood on deck and stared at the radar antenna spinning above them. One officer whispered, "We believed we were the modern ones." He didn't realize it yet, but he was watching the first visible sign of Germany's defeat. A defeat built not on battlefields, but in factories. August 2, 1943, Norfolk Naval Base, Virginia. The Liberty ships had docked at sunrise. Their human cargo, thousands of German prisoners, were met not by shouting guards or guns, but by the industrial roar of America in motion. The Norfolk base sprawled across 4,300 acres, cranes swinging in rhythm like the arms of a mechanical giant. Dozens of ships were being loaded and unloaded simultaneously. The prisoners counted 47 cargo vessels at once, more than the port of Hamburg handled in a week. Smoke, light and sound fused into something alien, the steady heartbeat of endless power. Lieutenant Friedrich Radke, a decorated Afrika Korps officer, wrote later, "Everywhere we looked, machines worked without rest. Cranes moved by electricity, not men. Conveyors fed ships automatically. There was no shouting, only humming. Germany had industry. America had rhythm. Even before stepping onto U.S. soil, the illusion of Nazi superiority had begun to fracture. But it would shatter on the train ride west. Instead of boxcars, the Germans boarded Pullman coaches, passenger cars with cushioned seats, dining service, and sleeping berths. The air smelled faintly of tobacco and soap. A young American guard apologized for the heat. "The air conditioning's out today," he said casually. Radke looked up in disbelief. Air conditioning? For prisoners, in August? As the train pulled away from the coast, the scene outside the windows became a moving panorama of contradiction. They passed parking lots filled with cars, not for officers or party officials, but for dock workers. Men in overalls climbed into their own automobiles and drove home to families who lived in houses with radios, refrigerators, and electric lights. Every assumption they had been taught about decadent, crumbling America dissolved mile by mile. That night, as the train rumbled through Virginia and the Carolinas, darkness never came. Each town, Martinsville, Danville, Greensboro, glowed with illumination. Shop signs burned bright even after midnight. Factories ran on night shifts, their windows glowing like furnaces of glass. Feldwebel Heinrich Müller, an electrical engineer before the war, began to do calculations in his head. "A single yard here uses more electricity in 1 hour than my entire district in Berlin does in a day," he wrote. "They waste light like we waste men." At a refueling stop in Roanoke, the prisoners watched railway workers resupply the train in 30 minutes. Automated coal loaders, electric pumps, mechanized lubrication arms. No shouting, no delay. It was routine for the Americans. For the Germans, it was revelation. A farmer's son named Carl Schmidt pressed his face against the glass as they passed another glowing town. "They leave lights on in empty rooms," he whispered, "even when no one's there." To him, it was unthinkable, the luxury of forgetting to conserve. By dawn, as the train crossed into Tennessee, the landscape turned silver under early sun. Endless farms, water towers, and billboards slid past, each one whispering the same unspoken truth. This was not a land fighting to survive. This was a land built to win. And for the first time, the proud soldiers of the Reich began to understand how wars are truly lost, not by defeat, but by comparison. By the second day, the German prisoners had stopped talking. They simply watched. The train cut through Tennessee under a white sky, the windows streaked with coal dust and wonder. Outside rolled a nation that defied mathematics. Factories larger than towns, rivers lined with power stations, smokestacks that never slept. The first great monument appeared near Knoxville, the Alcoa aluminum plant. It stretched for 3 miles along the river, its electric furnaces consuming 175,000 kilowatts of power, more than the entire city of Munich. Lieutenant Erich Hoffmann, a chemist from IG Farben, pressed his notebook to the window, sketching cooling towers, smoke vents, and pipes. Each of these furnaces, he murmured, would require a dedicated power station in Germany. Here they run dozens at once. The numbers betrayed everything they had believed. Germany had built its empire through scarcity and control. America had built its strength through surplus and freedom. The deeper the train moved into the heartland, the more staggering the evidence became. Near Louisville, the prisoners stared at a vast industrial complex, the Rubber Town plants, where 4 synthetic rubber factories stood side by side, raised from empty fields in less than 18 months. The guards told them that these facilities produced 800,000 tons of synthetic rubber annually. Hoffmann laughed bitterly. "That's impossible. We invented the process and never reached 120,000. The guard shrugged. "We just built more plants." Past Detroit, the train slowed as the horizon filled with glass and steel. There stood Ford's Willow Run, a single factory producing 1 B-24 bomber every 63 minutes. Radke, the Afrika Korps officer, counted 17 aircraft in various stages of assembly through the massive windows. "We were told American planes were crude, built in haste," he wrote later. "But I could see the precision of their work. Even the rivets gleamed in lines straighter than parade formations." Inside the train, silence spread. A few men took off their caps. Others simply stared, unblinking, as the line of factories passed like a moving map of defeat. When the train crossed the Mississippi at St. Louis, they looked down at barges moving beneath them, endless, slow, patient. Each one carried more grain than Germany could harvest in a season. The cranes along the riverbank never stopped, loading wheat, corn, and machinery in mechanical rhythm. Gefreiter Carl Schmidt, a farmer's son from Bavaria, whispered to no one, "They transport food as we transport ammunition." He wasn't exaggerating. The rail yards below handled enough wheat in a week to feed entire regions of Europe. And here it was. Routine. When night came, the planes lit up again. Not with explosions, but with the glow of factories still working past midnight. For every town they passed, 10 more flickered on the horizon. For the first time, the soldiers of the Reich began to understand what the generals in Berlin could not admit, that industrial might was not propaganda, but destiny. "We had conquered deserts," Hoffmann wrote, "but these people had conquered distance itself." August 5, 1943, Camp Hearn, Texas. The gates opened to a sight that left even the proudest officers silent. Rows of newly built wooden barracks, Fresh pine still golden in the sun stretched across the Texas prairie. Each had electric lights, glass windows, and screened porches to keep out the heat. Beyond them rose the camp hospital. Brick walls, white curtains, and a red cross painted so large it could be seen from the sky. The Germans had expected barbed wire and filth. What they found looked more like a small American town. When Oberstabsarzt Dr. Friedrich Bauer, chief surgeon of the 164th Light Division, entered the hospital, he stopped walking altogether. Inside stood X-ray machines newer than anything in Berlin. Surgical lamps gleaming. Cabinets lined with medical supplies the Reich hadn't seen in 2 years. And there, in a refrigerated cabinet, he saw bottles labeled penicillin. It was the miracle drug we had only heard of, he wrote later. And they used it on us. That detail spread through the camp like wildfire. Germany's best hospitals couldn't get penicillin. Here, the Americans gave it to wounded prisoners without hesitation. The ideological fortress of Nazi superiority cracked a little wider. In the kitchens, it shattered completely. The men assigned to cooking duty discovered walk-in refrigerators, gas ranges, and automatic dishwashers. They prepared meals for 5,000 prisoners using more food per day than most German towns received in a week. The regulations required 10% surplus to ensure every man was fed, and any uneaten food was discarded. Feldwebel Otto Krebs, once a hotel chef in Munich, wrote in his diary, "Today, I threw away more bread than my family has seen in 3 years. Not spoiled, simply excess. I wept as I did it." Each prisoner received a daily ration of fresh meat, milk, eggs, vegetables, and white bread, items that had vanished from the German table since 1939. And then came the small things that hurt the most. The guards had pocket watches. The mechanics wore leather boots. The American sergeant in charge of the kitchen chain smoked Lucky Strikes, stubbing them out half-finished. It wasn't cruelty. It was normalcy. The prisoners realized they were living inside an economy so vast that comfort had become background noise. At night, the barracks glowed softly under electric bulbs, and the men lay awake, staring at ceilings that never went dark. One whispered to another, "In Germany, my children sleep in basements. Here, the enemy gives me hot water." They had come expecting to resist re-education. Instead, they were being re-educated by plumbing, by light, by the simple act of waste. The desert soldiers of the Afrika Korps had faced British tanks, American bombers, and endless sandstorms without fear. But nothing terrified them more than realizing they were comfortable in defeat. By September 1943, America's hunger wasn't for war, it was for labor. Every able-bodied man was overseas, and the fields were ripening faster than they could be harvested. So the army made a decision both practical and fateful. The German prisoners would work. Trucks rolled out of Camp Hearn each morning, carrying groups of 50 POWs into the American countryside. No blindfolds, no secrecy, just open roads and open eyes. For men who had grown up on tales of American poverty and racial chaos, the drive through Texas farmland felt like an hallucination. Every farm had electricity. Every house had running water. Even the barns were wired with lights. At one cotton gin near Houston, Unteroffizier Herbert Lang stood watching a single machine devour mountains of raw cotton. Belts spun, gears churned, and white fiber poured out in streams of softness. "One machine here," he wrote, "does in 1 hour what my entire village could not do in a month." The farmer who owns it is not a baron or a party official, just a man in denim overalls. The farmer greeted them in broken German and offered cold water from a galvanized tank. When Lang asked how he managed so much land, the man pointed at the electric cables running across the field. "Colorado River Authority," he said. "Power's cheap out here. 90% of farms have it now." Lang had worked for Siemens before the war. He understood what that number meant. 90% electrification in a rural state. Germany, even in its most advanced provinces, had never reached half that. And what struck him most wasn't power itself. It was equality. The black field hands ate the same lunch as the white farmers. Sandwiches thick with meat, bottles of Coca-Cola clinking in the sun. They give even their Negroes more to eat than we give our soldiers, Lang wrote. And this they call normal. Across the Midwest, similar revelations unfolded. In Nebraska, prisoners worked sugar beet fields that stretched beyond sight. The combines roared past them, machines so efficient that a single unit replaced 100 men's labor. A teenage boy drove one of them, waving as he passed. The tractor he drives, Gefreiter Wilhelm Hoffmann noted, is worth more than everything my father ever owned. When I told him that, the boy laughed. He said it was old, and his father had ordered a better one. For the first time, these men understood that wealth here wasn't hoarded. It was scaled. Industry wasn't privilege. It was routine. They weren't watching propaganda films anymore. They were living inside America's secret weapon. Ordinary prosperity. When they returned to camp at dusk, tired and silent, they passed parking lots full of cars and neon signs advertising Coca-Cola, John Deere, Goodyear. Each one seemed to whisper the same quiet truth. Freedom builds faster. By winter 1943, something subtle yet irreversible had taken root in the Texas camps. The prisoners still saluted each morning, still sang their regiment songs, but the rhythm had changed. The old words no longer fit the new world they'd seen. Letters home, carefully censored yet still revealing, hinted at the quiet revolution of the mind. "We are treated well," wrote Feldwebel Kurt Zimmermann. "Too well. It is difficult to hate people who feed you better than your own government." Some officers tried to suppress the change. They organized clandestine education sessions, repeating that Germany would rise again, that American comfort was only decadence in disguise. But the words fell flat. Every day, the evidence around them contradicted the speeches. A single farm tractor replaced 50 laborers. A small-town factory in Kansas produced more processed food in a week than all of Rommel's supply columns had in a month. The guards, polite, unhurried, often curious about Germany itself, displayed a confidence born not from ideology, but from abundance. One night in December, under the dim light of a barrack bulb, Lieutenant Friedrich Radke, the same man who had marched across the African desert, sat with his diary open and a pencil trembling in his hand. "I once believed discipline made us strong," he wrote. "But these people are strong without fear. Their soldiers joke with officers. Their workers question superiors. Yet everything functions. Perhaps obedience is not strength at all." That sentence marked the break, not in battle lines, but in the internal map of loyalty. The same men who once quoted Hitler's speeches now debated engineering, production statistics, and electricity grids. They began sketching factory layouts from memory, discussing how Germany might rebuild after the war, using American methods. Even the most loyal began to question the silence of the Reich. "Why did we never see such things at home?" a sergeant asked. "If we were so advanced, why did we have nothing like this?" The most startling realization came to Dr. Bauer, the camp surgeon. Visiting a local hospital to exchange medical supplies, he saw a waiting room filled with civilians, white, black, rich, poor, treated in order of arrival. No separate queues, no uniforms of privilege. They treat illness, not rank, he noted. Here, value is measured by need, not position. That evening, he told his fellow officers something they never forgot. "We thought we were fighting for civilization, but civilization is here, on the other side of the wire." The men went silent. No one contradicted him. Outside, the Texas night glowed with a distant hum of power lines, the same quiet current that had illuminated their first night in America. Now it hummed inside their thoughts. The war for their loyalty was over. The war for their identity had begun. By mid-1944, the war's outcome was no longer a question, even inside the barbed wire. The newspapers delivered to Camp Hearn told the story plainly. Normandy, Rome, the fall of France's Atlantic Wall. Germany was collapsing, but the prisoners in Texas were not collapsing with it. They were changing. Something in them had shifted, from defiance to reflection. The POWs had started building things again. Workshops appeared beside the barracks. Model windmills, radios built from scavenged parts, even hand-bound books of poetry. The guards encouraged it. They called it productive recreation. But to the men inside, it was something more profound. Rehearsal. They had come as soldiers. Now they were engineers, artists, and planners. Feldwebel Otto Krebs, the former hotel chef who once wept over wasted bread, had been reassigned to the camp kitchen as an instructor for new arrivals. He began experimenting with ways to stretch rations, reduce waste, and organize menus, the habits of someone preparing for peace. The Americans waste because they can, he wrote, but they also build because they believe. Their abundance is not arrogance, it's optimism made visible. Every truck ride into the countryside became a lesson. The men observed crop rotation methods, irrigation systems, and mechanical repairs. Some secretly sketched designs, thinking not of escape, but of reconstruction. And then came a new influence: American educators. Universities began sending visiting teachers to POW camps under a quiet program called intellectual rehabilitation. History classes, engineering lectures, even lessons in democratic institutions. The Germans attended eagerly, not from compulsion, but curiosity. Dr. Friedrich Bauer, the camp surgeon, later described the turning point. They did not tell us to believe in freedom. They let us see it. In their teachers, in their rules, in their kindness. It was never a sermon. It was a mirror. The men compared this openness with the secrecy of their homeland, where questions invited suspicion and efficiency was a privilege of ideology. Radke, once proud of his Prussian discipline, now organized debates on post-war industry. His notes survive in the National Archives, sketches of factory layouts, power grids, even proposed reconstruction models for Germany's bombed cities. In the margins, one phrase repeats in pencil: efficiency through liberty. By the time word reached them of the Allied advance into Germany, their despair was mixed with something unexpected: anticipation. When we return, Zimmermann wrote, we will bring back what we learned: how to build without fear. Many would do exactly that. A generation later, German engineers, doctors, and educators traced their philosophies not to Berlin or Nuremberg, but to Texas, Nebraska, and Ohio, the places where defeat had taught them how freedom works. The barbed wire had never opened, but their minds had already stepped outside it. By the spring of 1945, as the Reich disintegrated in fire and ruin, Camp Hearn stood quiet beneath the Texas sun. The men inside listened to the radio reports in stunned silence. Berlin surrounded, Hitler's last broadcast, Goebbels' frantic decrees. Then suddenly, nothing. It was over. But for the prisoners, the real question had already changed. They no longer asked who had won, but why. For 2 years they had lived inside the paradox. A nation that fought the greatest war in history, yet never seemed to run out of comfort, light, or confidence. America's true weapon had not been the tank, the plane, or even the atom. It was systemic faith, the belief that progress was ordinary, that invention required no permission. In his final diary entry before repatriation, Lieutenant Friedrich Radke tried to put it into words. We thought we understood power, but theirs is not built from fear or rank. It is built from trust, in systems, in one another. They delegate, they experiment, they waste, and yet they multiply. Our command feared mistakes. Their command expects them. That line circulated secretly through the camp, copied by hand, passed like contraband between bunks. Trust as strength. It was the opposite of everything the Reich had taught. Dr. Friedrich Bauer saw it in medicine. They share knowledge as if it cannot run out, he wrote. In Germany, information was hoarded like gold. Here, it circulates like air. Even the simplest laborers had absorbed the same idea. Otto Krebs, the camp cook, summarized it best while cleaning his kitchen for the last time. They win because they plan for plenty, not for scarcity. When they build one factory, they are already drawing the next. That philosophy had saturated everything the prisoners saw, from the redundant cranes in Norfolk to the endless convoys of Liberty ships to the cheap abundance of white bread. It was not excess, it was design. The Americans didn't conquer through ideology. They conquered through habit. When word came that Germany had surrendered, the camp loudspeaker played the news in English and German. Some men wept quietly. Others stood motionless, eyes fixed on the horizon. But none cheered. There was no need. They had already seen what victory looked like long before it was declared. A few hours later, a guard opened the gate and said, almost gently, "It's over." No one moved, Radke later recalled. We did not step forward, because in that moment, we knew. We had been free for months already, in our minds. In that stillness, under the humming wires and the pale Texas sky, the last illusion of the Reich dissolved. The revelation was complete. America had not defeated them with force. It had outgrown them. June 1946, Bremerhaven, Germany. The ship that carried them home crossed a very different Atlantic. The war was over, but the peace felt heavier. Cities along the German coast lay in ruins. Hamburg, a forest of chimneys. Cologne, an open wound of stone and silence. As the gangway lowered, the men hesitated. The same soldiers who had once arrived in Texas under guard now stood free, but they no longer looked victorious, nor defeated, just changed. Feldwebel Otto Krebs clutched a small notebook. Inside were recipes, ration charts, and sketches of American kitchens. He would later open a restaurant in Munich, using what he learned about mass cooking, waste reduction, and refrigeration. In post-war Germany, it became one of the first to serve American-style coffee and eggs. Lieutenant Friedrich Radke returned to Stuttgart with a different kind of plan, pages of diagrams labeled industrial rhythm. Within 5 years, he joined a manufacturing firm that adopted assembly methods almost identical to what he had seen through the window of Ford's Willow Run. Dr. Friedrich Bauer carried home no trophies, only a conviction. That medicine should serve humanity, not power. He became a public health advocate in the new Federal Republic, lecturing on the lessons of Texas, that the true victory of civilization is measured in mercy. Each man carried the same private memory, a single image that had haunted them since the night of their arrival in Mexia, Texas. Light. It had been the first crack in their certainty, a horizon that glowed where propaganda said it should be dark. Years later, they still spoke of it in reverent tones, not the blinding light of bombs or searchlights, but the steady, unflinching glow of a nation that believed in abundance. We saw, wrote Radke in his memoir, that power could be gentle and prosperity could be shared. The light never left us. Historians would later call it the American Revelation. But for those who lived it, it was simpler. It was the realization that faith in progress, open, wasteful, confident, could be stronger than fear. When West Germany began its Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle of the 1950s, Many of its quiet architects had once stood behind American barbed wire. They built factories that hummed with efficiency, hospitals that welcomed all, and schools that taught free thought instead of obedience. They had seen what civilization looked like when it trusted itself. And so, in a small, poetic symmetry, the final victory of that war was not claimed on any battlefield, but in every German city reborn under electric light, a reflection of what they had first witnessed through the train windows of Texas. They thought they'd seen defeat. What they saw was the future.